Hi, my name is Mark Dance, and this is my model railroad, the Columbia and Western. In this short video, we hope to introduce the layout to you, talk a little bit about how it's operated, the trains that are run, how you interact with the dispatcher. The intention being, if you haven't operated on the layout before, that it makes your first operating session more enjoyable. The Columbia and Western is located in a converted two-car garage at the back of our property. It is insulated, but it can get warm in the summer, so please come prepared for that. With the lights on and a full complement of operators, it can get warm. The layout is located on two decks. The lower deck is 42 inches off the ground, and that includes the primary switching areas of Castlegar and Craft, as well as Nelson Yard. The second deck runs from about 56 to 64 inches in height off the ground, the railhead, and that's primarily for scenery. It's the area over the fair and pass. Those decks run around the outside of the garage. Entrance is through two swing gates. And in the middle there is a peninsula which wraps around the isolated Slocan-Nakusp barge-served rail branches. The Columbia and Western is located in southeastern British Columbia. The prototype are Canadian Pacific's Nelson, Boundary, Rossland, and Slocan subdivisions circa 1970. Those subdivisions, along with the storied Kettle Valley subdivisions, made up the southern main line across southern British Columbia, constructed by the Canadian government to prevent all the mineral wealth of south and central British Columbia being siphoned off to the American lines of the Great Northern and Northern Pacific. Operations on the Columbia and Western focus on the division point yard of Nelson, BC. This division point separated the Nelson subdivision, which runs from Cranbrook to the east to Nelson, from the Boundary subdivision, which begins at Nelson Yard and runs west all the way to Midway. On the model, I represent everything east of Troop Junction through staging, and everything west of Cascade, including Grand Forks and Midway, similar through western staging. There are two main branches that leave the Boundary subdivision. One is the isolated Slocan and Caslo branch, which leaves the main line at South Slocan, travels up the Slocan Valley, terminating at Slocan City, where the train is then loaded onto a barge for the trip over to Rosebery and the Caslo subdivision, which runs up to Nakusp. There is a major branch which runs south from Castlegar to Trail. On the model, this is represented through staging, which is almost immediately south of Castlegar, and this represents the heavy industries of the Cominco smelter and fertilizer plants at Tadnak, Trail, and Warfield. Train control, as on the prototype, is by dispatcher using timetable and train order. In order to get train orders to the crew, there are, as on the prototype, train order stations at South Slocan, Castlegar, Corkendall, Farron, Cascade, and Rosebery. In addition, there are register stations, one on the Nelson sub at Troop Junction, the second, the combination of Slocan Junction and Castlegar, and the third at Cascade. In addition to these train order and register stations, there are also phone boxes available for the crews to use at Shields and Fife siding. The main traffic flow on the Columbia and Western involves the movement of heavy materials to and from the Cominco smelter and Trail through Nelson on east to Cranbrook. By 1970, the abandonment of a large chunk of the Kettle Valley to the west meant that the Boundary subdivision west of Castlegar was operated primarily as a branch line. That branch saw large volumes of wood products, including cut lumber and wood chips, flowing from the mills at Grand Forks and Midway east to the Craft pulp mill at Castlegar, and then finished product moving east to Cranbrook. Similar types of materials also flowed from the Caslo branch and the Slocan branch south to South Slocan and then on east to Cranbrook. I have taken the liberty of reinstating some of the ore traffic that flowed from Phoenix at the turn of the 20th century. That's allowed us to run ore freights between Phoenix with helpers across Farron Summit through Castlegar and then south to the Cominco Trail smelters. We run nearly 20 trains during a normal operating session on the Columbia and Western. These include the Nelson West switching job, which is the primary classification job for the layout. The Nelson East switching job, which can also run Hostling as well as switching the East End industries. We run east and westbound way freights over the Boundary subdivision. We also run ore freights both east and west between Phoenix and West Staging and Tadnak and Trail. Because of their weights and lengths, these often require pusher helpers to get up to the summit at Farron. Occasionally we'll also run plow trains, and one of the more interesting jobs is the craft switcher, which runs from Nelson to Castlegar and back and takes nearly the whole session to run. Finally, there is the isolated Slocan branch, which has its own dedicated way freight, which moves from the boundary subdivision up the Slocan Valley, loads itself onto the barge at Slocan City, offloads itself at Rosebery, and then terminates at Nakusp. While the train movement is governed by timetable and train order, the movements of the cars is controlled by labels on the top of each car. In general, the color will indicate to which town or direction the car is to be forwarded, while if there's an acronym or a number, that indicates the car is to be switched out to an industry on the layout. Blue represents all cars moving to the east to Creston and Cranbrook. Orange are cars to be switched to the west on the boundary subdivision. Pink are cars to Trail. Yellow, Castlegar. And gray are cars that are moving north on the Slocan branch, eventually to Nakusp. White are for the division points themselves, so cars that are going to be resident either in Nelson Yard or to be switched out in industries in Nelson. Cars that have a green label are going to be moving south along the Burlington Northern, either through the Nelson and Fort Shepherd branch, originating at Troop Junction just to the east of Nelson, or to be switched out at the Carson Spur interchange at Cascade. If a car label has an acronym or a number, it means it's destined for an industry to be switched on the layout. If there is no acronym, it means it's going to make its way to a staging point. If you get to a station and find that there are cars that have been that have not been set out for their final destinations, it's the job of the way freights to move those off spots to the appropriate industries. All this information is resident in the train instructions, which we'll cover at a later point in the video. So now let's walk through a typical job. Most jobs will begin in the crew lounge, which is a very fancy word for a pretty small room that's adjacent to the layout itself. In this lounge, the dispatcher is located. I will probably spend most of my time here as the superintendent as well if I'm not helping you out in the layout room proper. We have a train lineup which indicates roughly the trains we would like to run during a session, and there's a call board. The call board indicates the job name, where you're called on the layout, so Nelson for example, or Trail, which is south staging, the train number, or the extra number if it's an extra, and the time it's called. I've also taken the liberty of grading each of the jobs according to what I believe is their relative hardness. And that, I use a ski slope analogy for that. So green circles are easy, blue dots, blue squares are moderately difficult, and the black diamonds are challenging. So I'm feeling especially adventurous today, so I'm going to sign up for a black diamond, the craft switcher. Put my initials there. Note that I'm going to be called in Nelson at 5 a.m. That's our fast clock time, my way to the train room. Entrance to the layout is by way of two swing gates. The upper one remains closed for the operating session, but the lower one can be readily opened and closed to allow people to move in and out from the crew lounge. Please always check to make sure that there aren't any trains coming before you open the gate, and when you close it, please have a look to make sure that the tracks are properly aligned. Once you enter the layout area, proceed to the station where your train's been called. I'm running the craft switcher, so I'm proceeding to the Nelson Yard because the craft switcher originates in Nelson Yard. I'm going to check the fascia for the train instructions. The train instructions are a small trifold pamphlet that are attached to a clipboard. And the clipboards are either velcroed or clipped in some manner to the fascia or the valances at the station where the trains are called. The clipboards have a lanyard which allows for the operators to put them around their necks so they don't have to use their hands. On the back of each clipboard is a copy of the timetable, and on the front is a pencil for making notes. As you move around the layout, you can note your OS times, as well as the train instructions themselves. Each train has a corresponding set of train instructions. It's a trifold sheet printed on both sides, effectively making 6 separate pages. The first page includes the train number, its name, the role it plays, its typical motive power, and maximum car lengths. It also will have an abbreviated schedule indicating which trains it may meet along its route. The backmost page has a write-in section for a wheel report. In most cases, I will have written in not only the locomotive numbers and the caboose numbers, but the number of loads and empties that the train is beginning with. And I will indicate which stations along the way you will have work if you have work to do along your route. The top section of the last page also includes the Digitrax number so you can address the lead locomotive of the consist. In between the first and last pages are a schematic of your route, including all the industry names and acronyms that correspond to the labels you will find on tops of the cars on your train, as well as special instructions that you need to make a note of, including slow orders, any special train register information, or drop and pick locations that you need to be aware of. On the back of every clipboard is a timetable. The timetable governs the Nelson subdivision and the Boundary subdivision. The Roslyn subdivision and Slocan subdivisions are dark. In general, trains outbound from Nelson, those are eastbound on the Nelson subdivision and westbound on the Boundary subdivision, are scheduled, although extras may run. And all trains inbound to Nelson, those are the eastbound on the Boundary and the westbound on the Nelson subdivisions, are run as extras.